Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we have organized two lectures on inclusive governance. We have already discussed part of it yesterday, and we'll continue from there, and we'll see how the exclusion is being done at level of a state, at corporate level, and also at civil society level. So, and how it could be overcome, and how inclusive governance could be made more feasible. We will discuss all the aspects of it. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Satish Jha. He teaches political science in Delhi University and have keen eye on the public administration system in India. Also have field experience how the administration works. So I hope his knowledge will help us to understand this inclusive governance in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for EduSet lecture on the topic inclusive governance. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Amrinji. In fact, I would like to take off from where I had left yesterday. And, in yesterday's lecture on inclusive governance, we took into account, the entire discourse of development, the way it has been, structured in India in the last more than 60 years. Yesterday we also discussed that how Nehru, the architect of India's developmental strategy in the formative years, thought in terms of making an inclusive process, development as an inclusive process, because in his worldview, growth, development, and democracy, all three of them had to go together. So therefore, what Nehru did at that time, that through planning process, through overemphasis on the state and its agencies, through number of measures. For example, yesterday we discussed that how in 50s he also thought in terms of Panchayati Raj institutions, community development programs, and cooperative movement to make it more and more participatory, make it more and more inclusive. And therefore, I think that the 50s and 60s was dominated by this type of perspective. But at the same time, we also discussed yesterday that how in late 60s and 70s, suddenly it was realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the strategy of development which was pursued over the years, what was then and today also remembered as Nehru Mahalanobis model of development. And therefore the 70s started with a new type of churning, in which instead of growth, the focus shifted to redistribution. And therefore we discussed that how this redistribution in fact turned into a political populism. Instead of becoming a valid and tangible policy framework, it turned into a political populism in name of Garibi Hatao and similar such measures, nationalization of banks and so on and so forth. So redistributional agenda, it tried to achieve through a measure or by embarking on a path which led to more and more state-centric development, so much so that this period subsequently is remembered as license permit Raj. Now the 70s redistribution through the instrumentality of state and other agencies of the state, by realization that in name of collaboration, the mixed economy, private and public, it led to a situation where the market monopoly was being created, and therefore number of measures which were taken to curb these monopolies of private capital, I think that 70s, when focused on all these things, but at the same time it led to, over increase in the state intervention in economic activities and social process. So this over emphasis and over dependence on the state led to two three tendencies, and one of them was over centralization, bureaucratic centralization, which characterized this phase of India's economic development, which is, I just mentioned, license permit Raj. Therefore 70s, whereas tried to balance growth with redistribution, but at the same time created certain other anomalies, and those anomalies in 80s started telling upon the entire an entire strategy of development in India, where more and more exclusions were resulting due to this type of bureaucratic centralism. There were more discontents in the society, and 80s started on a different note. I mentioned yesterday that 80s started with some sort of a new climate, political climate, in which liberalization did not appear to be as a pejorative term as it was earlier. And Indira Gandhi's tenure between 80 to 84, in fact, to some extent symbolized that new mood, political mood. But it was Rajiv Gandhi's tenure as Prime Minister after 1985, which I mentioned, that initiated a series of measures which people today believe that it was in a true sense a liberalized policy of liberalization. But that was part of the strategy. But what happened in 90s was more of a crisis situation, response to a crisis situation, because there are two types of policies in name of liberalization and privatization and other things take place. One is out of a larger strategy which the political class chalks out. Other is which results due to certain crisis which suddenly erupts, and the political class has to respond to those crises. So 90s, which in true sense is a decade which is remembered for total transformation of India's economic development and the strategies surrounding it, because this 90 started on a crisis note, because many of us recall that how 90s, particularly 91, there was a severe balance of payment crisis, foreign exchange reserve were dipping, and that led to a situation where a coalition government, not a coalition but rather minority government, came into power led by Narsim Rao, and finance ministry was being headed by Manmohan Singh, and two of them decided to completely overhaul the economic strategies dealing with economic development, and that basically signaled a new period in India's political history, when for the first time India decided to approach IMF and World Bank for assistance. And as part of that package, as we discussed yesterday also, that how IMF and World Bank were already basically grappling with this problem, particularly in case of Latin America and Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. In 89, IMF had already come out with a full-fledged prescription for sub-Saharan Africa, which particularly which was witnessing a debt trap. So I think that a story we saw yesterday, that how the American economy was in crisis, how the interest rate was being increased, how the OPEC crisis took place in 70s, and due to all these things there was a debt problem, there was a debt trap for the African countries and Latin American countries, and IMF and World Bank were being asked to tackle that problem. But that apart, what happened in India, that 91 we approached IMF and World Bank for assistance, particularly we requested them to bail us out from this balance of payment crisis. They did it, but at the same time they imposed certain conditionalities, and those conditionalities basically were more or less the same what World Bank and IMF were doing in case of some other countries of sub-Saharan Africa and other places. So what happened that at the package it came, and that perhaps became famous in name of the slogan of liberalization, privatization, structural adjustment. Now all these things symbolize a particular type of strategy so far as World Bank and IMF were concerned. For example, a structural adjustment implied a more liberalized, import export policy, some sort of overhauling the entire fiscal and monetary policies and so on and so forth, which economists have been talking in different discourses. Now what happened that due to this structural adjustment program, the 90s led to a situation where this Nehru-Mahalanobis model of development, which was going on here since independence, suddenly, got completely transformed. Now, what happened that earlier we believed in the mixed economy, the partnership between the private enterprises and the public. Now, instead of that, the focus shifted on downsizing the state structure, downsizing the public enterprises, public sector, and more leverage to the private enterprises and private sector. So what happened, that was one in name of liberalization and giving incentive to private capital, privatization. Secondly, the public sector units particularly, which were found to be sick, and even otherwise many these public sector units were problems afflicting those units, public sector units were addressed, and then the disinvestment policy started. Now along with this, the fiscal deficit was sought to be addressed. New monetary policies were introduced. Import export policies, particularly opening Indian market for foreign investment, for foreign goods. All these things were going on roughly at the same time when the world community was busy in institutionalizing a supranational organization called World Trade Organization, WTO, which came into existence in 1995. So all these things coincided along with a new process which had already been unleashed, and it was called at that time the globalization. So globalization at the world level, at the world scale, which was going on, under which the movement of capital and the closure of markets were being totally removed, and at the domestic level we were basically witness to a strategy which was basically going on in name of liberalization, privatization, and structural adjustment. Now all these things at domestic level were going on. In the meanwhile, the World Bank, which earlier had already started in 89 to address this issue of governance, because yesterday we discussed that how this government from entire discourse has moved from government to governance, and what this semantic shift suggests, that why should we use the term governance, not government. And then we found that how the government and governance, the difference implies that government, when talk of government, we basically mean those agencies which traditionally constitute the part of the state institutions or the government. But when we talk of governance, it is not simply the state, it is not simply those institutions which are part of the state, but also two other important agencies, and they are market and civil society. So when the focus shifted to governance from government, in fact the focus was on all three of them. How the state is functioning, how the civil society is functioning, and how market is functioning. And at all three levels, this discourse basically pitched the entire thing at three levels and tried to relate three of them. And therefore, the 97 World Bank report, which is perhaps the most comprehensive discussion of this concept of the good governance, I think around 97, they came to this conclusion that good governance perhaps should be the mission of these multilateral donor agencies, the funding agencies, to oversee in those countries which are desirous of any assistance from World Bank and IMF, and that will be contingent on on delivering a good governance in those societies. So I think that financial assistance was tied to the good governance. Now, good governance also was clearly defined around that time, that what implies good governance. Now, for them, for the World Bank, the good governance implies civil service reforms and the private sector initiatives, market mechanism, celebration of market mechanism. The third, accountability, and particularly some of the mechanisms which are already there, known to the political class. I think those mechanisms should be completely relied upon. For example, the Ombudsman, the Auditor General, Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, such agencies in democracy should be particularly made use of. And then transparency and information availability, particularly the free media. So these four important components of good governance, I think, started coming out of this discourse, which was taking place at the level of World Bank and IMF. Now, the good governance was also now being defined in a manner where it didn't imply simply market and private investment, but also inclusion, that this should lead to more and more inclusion of the people in society, because it was apprehended that kind of free enterprises which were being promoted in name of good governance might lead to number of exclusions, different types of exclusion in society, and therefore those exclusions should be addressed beforehand. Now, at what level this exclusion would be dealt with, that was also hinted through this discourse, and it was basically suggested that this should be tackled at four levels and through four measures. Number one, the participation of people. There should be more and more participation of the people. Number two, the management of resources through greater management of resources through greater decentralization, because market and the private enterprises were being promoted in name of curbing centralization, which characterized most of the third world countries' developmental strategies earlier. Therefore, if it was a substitute for centralization, then it should naturally promote decentralization. But market has a tendency sometimes to also promote centralization through other means. Therefore, the attempt was to curb decentralization and promote decentralization. Now, the third was the greater responsiveness, that these entire process should be more responsive to the needs of the people. And finally, the target was also set in terms of addressing the question of equity and justice in the society, so that the exclusion problem does not become explosive. So I think overall we find that 90s, the World Bank and IMF were dealing with these issues in this type of framework in name of good governance, particularly for those countries who were in midst of economic reforms like India, which we have just now discussed because of certain crises which emerged here. Now, but at the same time, every country has its own specific problem, and India is no exception. So therefore, what World Bank was suggesting as a donor agency, as a funding agency, we had to abide by that if we wanted their assistance, and we wanted initially their assistance, and therefore some of the things which were done in India in early 90s were part of this response to their prescriptions and their conditionalities. But subsequently we find that Indian political class started addressing their own challenges and own problems, because for 40 years or around 50 years, 50 years, India was witnessing a planned strategy of development, and the twin goal of basically justice, social and economic, and freedom, political, through democracy, they were sought to be attained through this strategy of development. Now suddenly that strategy ran into trouble, and a new set of measures were being taken. So therefore there was a new thinking, new churning, new reflections which were coming in India around that time, the 90s. And 90s was also a politically very unstable period, because 90s witnessed on the one hand a minority government from 91 to 96, and then afterwards we find number of coalition governments. a very unstable political arrangement, and at the same time that coincided with this type of situation. Now, because of all these things, what we find that India 90s is a very turbulent period in the political history of India. At the same time, India also had to withstand the sanctions, economic sanctions, because of Pokhran 298, the nuclear test. So all these things created a situation that 90s was a very challenging decade for India. But somehow Indian political class tried to overcome those challenges and address those challenges through number of measures. Now, as you have seen that this good governance discourse was going on, as per the good governance discourse, certain economic and non-economic set of measures were being suggested. As economic measures, we have already seen that how cut and reduction in public expenditure, fiscal consolidation and privatization, these were basically the mantras which were called at that time structural adjustment program. And as non-economic component of this package was basically creating a more accountable public political order, basically deepening the democratic process through making it more participatory, electoral reforms, a proper respect for human rights. All these things were also being asked to be accomplished along with those economic targets. So I think this was something which was going on at that level. But in Indian situation, there were different types of problems which were emerging, and those problems were leading to a situation where on the one hand we were addressing certain issues of certain issues of growth and redistribution, particularly growth, but at the same time it was resulting into different types of exclusion, and that exclusion was becoming quite visible by the end of 90s and in the beginning of 2000, when we suddenly discovered that the poverty was increasing, deprivation index was increasing, hunger deaths, farmer suicide, so on and so forth. So number of problems suddenly started coming to the fore, and it was realized that unless some preventive measures, unless some remedial measures are taken, this new strategy might turn out to be a disaster so far as India is concerned. So therefore it was tackled at different levels through a new thinking, a new strategy, so much so that subsequently the planning process declared its entire mission to be inclusive growth. That not simply growth but inclusive growth. Growth which should include more and more people. Rather it was excluding people, it should be more inclusive in nature. So inclusive growth was made the target. Inclusive development, more and more people should be included in this process. Therefore the new millennium started on this note that inclusive development should be the mission, not simply attaining growth at the cost of at the cost of sufferance of the people in a situation where poverty becomes more pronounced, where people become more deprived, and so on and so forth. So therefore we find that 90s led to a situation where you had good governance, globalization, and then this entire strategy of structural adjustment taking place in India, and some of the policy prescriptions coming from the World Bank and IMF, and India abiding by those prescriptions. But secondly, Indian thinking on this issue was simultaneously also going on and trying to address the issues, that how to deal with a different type of problem, because India is characterized with all sorts of diversity in terms of regional development, in terms of in sort of diversity of culture, in terms of diversity of thinking, and so on and so forth. So therefore Indian situation required a different type of handling, and therefore we have to see that how the Indian political class responded to this challenge, and how this inclusive governance became the motto, became the mission of the political dispensation so far as the economic development is concerned, and administration and governance are concerned. And therefore, I told you that planning process now talks of inclusive development, inclusive growth. Now, in the 90s, we find that on the one hand, now the shift from government to governance led to now creation of 3 levels of actors in this process: the state, the market, and the civil society. And at the same time, it was also realized that exclusion will also be possible at all 3 levels: state, market, and civil society. Earlier, the possibilities of exclusion were mostly at the level of state and civil society, but now new agency is also coming to the fore, that is market. So market might lead to exclusion. It is not that in order to overcome centralizing tendencies of a state, market is being brought in, and therefore that would lead to inclusive growth and inclusive policies automatically. That was not the case. So at all 3 levels, state, market, and civil society, it was thought that inclusive measures would have to be taken. Now, let's start with the state. Now, state, it was believed that the major failure of a state was in terms of its centralizing policies, what we discussed in our license, permit, Raj, and other things. And that created an exclusionary policy where more and more people were excluded from this process. And another was the bureaucratic hurdles. So basically, two complemented each other, but this was the major problem of the state-centric development which was taking place in India. And therefore, in order to curb these tendencies in this new period, new thinking which was going on for good governance, for inclusive governance, a set of measures were thought of, and the measures were now a better federalization. India is already a federal polity. You have a center, a state, and they have their demarcated jurisdictions. They have their own rights, constitutionally guaranteed rights. But it was believed that a better, more robust federalized India would be more more in harmony with this new thinking. Therefore, the federalization should be on agenda. Number 2, the issue was, along with federalization, decentralization. In other words, one can say the multi-level federalism was being thought of. That normally in federal discourse you have only relationship between center and the states. But in a multi-level federal discourse, you have the 3 levels of decentralization and devolution: center, states, and the units below the state, the local level governance, what is called. I mean, in Indian context, one can talk of Panchayati Raj institutions and municipal corporations. So basically, the multi-level federalism, number 1, the center-state relations should be put at a more robust footing, and secondly, decentralization and devolution of power. And therefore, the 90s, we find that 93 we had 2 important constitutional amendments, 73rd and 74th amendment to the constitution, Panchayati Raj and municipal corporations. Now, 73rd and 74th amendment, of course, India had Panchayati Raj institutions earlier. We have discussed that how in the period of Nehru itself, this Balwant Rai Mehta committee came, and then community development program was reviewed, and then he suggested Panchayati Raj institutions, and that started in late 50s. Then subsequently in 70s, you had Ashok Mehta committee to review this entire things, and some 80s we had some regional experiments in Karnataka, Andhra, West Bengal for Panchayati Raj bodies. All these things were going on, but 90s is different in the sense that this Panchayati Raj discourse was, or decentralization discourse was given a constitutional status, because constitutionally it was mandated that every state will be required to periodically hold elections for these bodies, local self-governments, I mean the Panchayati Raj institutions, and then not only elections, but it was also required that these states will be required to do certain things as per the constitutional provisions. And now, for example, it was mandated that every state will have election commission, every state will have a finance commission, that how the resources should be distributed between the state and these local bodies institutions. Then there will be a uniform 3-tier structure, village assembly at the base throughout the country. There will be no diversity which characterized the earlier experiments. And the most important thing was that the issue of exclusion was politically being addressed at that time at two levels, at the level of gender and at the level of caste. And at the level of gender, it was mandated that there will be 1/3 seats would be reserved for women, both at the level of representation and at the level of chairmanship of these bodies also. So women reservation, women empowerment became the most important component of this attempt of devolution of power and decentralization. But at the same time, this caste issue was also addressed, and as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which were considered to be those sections of society which have been facing this exclusion for ages. Therefore, like there are provisions in the constitution for parliament and assemblies, I think SCAs and STs also found reservation at the local bodies. Then at the same time, at district level, the planning committees, committee and planning boards were thought of, because local level planning, because what characterized the earlier attempts of planning was that it was highly centralized. What is required for local level was being decided at Delhi. So in order to overcome that problem, it was suggested that the local level planning should be encouraged, and every district will have a district planning committee. So all these measures were being included through these amendments of the constitution and were being made mandatory for the states to abide by. Now, the problem was that, as we discussed earlier also, that the states have been very vocal in terms of demanding their rights vis-a-vis the center. But when it comes to the devolution of power resources to the level below the state administration, they develop cold feet. And therefore, we have seen that in spite of constitutional amendments, it is much different from what was earlier, but still we find that the states have been very sluggish in terms of implementing some of the things which are even constitutionally mandated. For example, district planning committees, I don't think they are still functioning in the same way as it was visualized at that time. Similarly, of course, elections are not taking place regularly. The exclusion issue has been addressed considerably. I mean, women and scheduled castes and scheduled tribes reservation have led to a situation where, in all over India, you can see the massive participation and representation of these sections in the local governance. So these issues are there, but the problem of resources, that these Panchayati Raj institutions are still suffering from resources which are not at their disposal. Then the certain other measures were taken in 90s. For example, during Narasimha Rao government, it was decided that every MP will have local area development fund, and that will be utilized and used for certain purposes, which in fact coincide, rather clash with the jurisdiction of these Panchayati Raj bodies, as they have been mentioned in 11th schedule of the constitution after the 73rd, 74th amendment. So I think this local area development fund of MPs, which ultimately also went to the court, that how an administrator can be, how a legislator can also become administrator and so on and so forth, but that is a separate issue. What I am trying to say, that these Panchayati Raj institutions, their jurisdiction, their autonomy, their functioning have not been attained at the same level as it was visualized through these amendments, because of a number of problems, which is not possible to discuss all of them here. What I am trying to say, that this attempt started for devolution and decentralization in 90s. Now the problem of these bodies, I mean, decentralization and devolution strategy also met number of hurdles, roadblocks. For example, because of the prevalence of patriarchy in the countryside, patriarchy in Indian society as a whole. So what happens, that because of patriarchal structure, even if you empower women by 1/3 seats, getting reserved for them, what we find, that the women become members and the chairman, but they don't, function because of the presence of this patriarchal structure, which creates problem for them. Similarly, we find that, the caste hierarchy in the society also affects the functioning of these Panchayati Raj institutions in spite of this reservation provision for the SCs and STs, because that creates roadblocks. You have a parallel caste panchayats functioning along with these political panchayats, I mean institutional panchayats, and sometimes their jurisdiction overlap and they don't allow these institutions to function. Rather, some of the functionaries of these bodies have to have to take directives from them, and I think that creates a big problem, and which is surfacing in different parts of the country, so much so that even now the Supreme Court had to intervene in it. Now, similarly, you have the problem of inequality. I mean, the land reforms issue is still unaccomplished in many parts of the country, the inequality in the societies, and therefore the class differences also affect the functioning of these representatives who are there, and they fail to perform the way they should be performing. So all these problems have been there, all these problems are basically are emerging, but in spite of that we can see that at a policy level this initiative tried to tackle this issue of centralization, which was considered to be one of the maladies of Indian developmental strategy, in Nehru, Mahalanobis discourse, and subsequently even Indira Gandhi and other prime ministers tried to only solidify them. So therefore this centralization issue was addressed through number of measures, as we have discussed: federalization number 1, decentralization and devolution number 2. Then the third was of downsizing the state, that how states should be downsized, so much so that because earlier development or the governance was characterized by overbearing state. Now attempt was to minimize its size as much as possible. So therefore some of the functions which were being discharged by the state were handed over to some other agencies, and it started in 80s during Rajiv Gandhi's time, when voluntary sector of the society was being encouraged, but subsequently it became part and parcel of our developmental strategy, developmental discourse, and this was the NGOs, non-governmental organizations. To some extent, a lot of people say that NGOization of the development, which happened in a subsequent period, particularly 90s. So NGOs, advent of the NGO sector as a complement to the state sector, so far development was concerned. Voluntary groups, organizations, of course, but it was not something new for India. It had been going on for many decades. You must have heard about Bhudan Andolan and even Jayaprakash Narayan is starting different types of initiatives. So voluntary efforts were there, but now it acquired a different type of significance, because now it was being strategized in a different way, so much so that it was thought of a complementary or complementary agencies of the state. Now apart from NGOs and voluntary groups, there are also the issues pertaining to administrative reforms, because the two problems we discussed, one was the failure of plan development because of centralization, and number was the bureaucratic hurdles because of this colonial mindset. So administrative reforms, now incentives, disincentives, and then citizens charters, all of these things were being thought of. A more accountable administration, more accountable bureaucracy, a different type of training to be imparted to them, so that they are considered the part and parcel of this process. All these things were also being debated, and therefore the Administrative Reforms Commission was formed subsequently, Second Administrative Reforms Commission, and a number of suggestions and the measures were given for revamping Indian administration. At the same time, in order to make it more inclusive, the governance, in fact the transparency was considered to be very important, because what happened earlier in name of this, in period of this centralized economic growth, centralized development, what happened that the entire system was it was lacking transparency, because in name of Official Secret Act and other things, people were totally unaware that what was being done, for whom it was being done, in what manner it was being done. People were totally in dark, and that created a lot of disconnect between the people and the political class. So therefore, the transparency, I think that was also being suggested and hammered by the IMF and World Bank, but the transparency was also considered to be one of the requirements. Now therefore, you had number of movements in the society, in the civil society, for having a more transparent governance, particularly when situation was emerging, when you had the massive foreign investment, you had the market becoming a very important agency of development. So transparency was required, and as a result of that, we find that number of campaigns starting in the society. The most important campaign was the right for information, right to information, which subsequently led to enactment at RTI Act, which is considered to be one of the most significant landmark in our post-independent political history, where now people have been empowered to seek information about each and every act which is being done by the executive. So therefore, this RTI, which resulted, due to a very sustained campaign in the civil society, led by a number of civil society activists and organizations, Aruna Roy and others in Rajasthan, and many other similar efforts were made. Finally, the RTI Act came into existence. Simultaneously, what was innovated in 1980s by the Supreme Court in name of public interest litigation, PIL, which has also acquired a different type of name as judicial activism, under which the judiciary started intervening in executive and legislative actions. So PIL was also used for for making the system more transparent and accountable. So PIL and RTI, the two main instruments which have been used in recent times to hold to the entire system accountable for their actions. I think these are the two measures which have emerged due to number of factors, as you have discussed, some thinking at the part of the political class, and some churning in the civil society, the movements, the protest, the campaign in the civil society. So I think that they together have created a situation. For example, PIL is the creation of judiciary, the Supreme Court. I think some very progressive, broad-minded, change-oriented judges in the Supreme Court created a situation where people were armed with this power, this instrument PIL. But at the same time, RTI is a result of both, the civil society initiatives and activities and actions, as well as some thinking in the political class, and through National Advisory Council and other things which were constituted when UPA government was formed. So I think these two instruments have been very powerful instruments so far as the transparency project is concerned, to hold the entire system accountable for their actions. But at the same time, recently we have seen now there is a powerful movement growing for a Lokpal and the Lokayukt, which is basically the Indian name for an institution which is called Ombudsman. Now the World Bank and IMF also, while talking of transparency and responsiveness, talked about Ombudsman. This is basically, the European, Scandinavian countries had this type of. Sweden, in fact, is considered to be very important for this. That in parliamentary democracy, how this, agency, this institution of Ombudsman can supplement the parliamentary efforts to bring accountability in the system. And therefore, in Indian version of Lokpal and Lokayukt, which started way back in 60s when the first Administrative Reforms Commission was formed, and it recommended the formation of these bodies, but that has been hanging fire for last 40 years. But recently, because of the civil society protest and the movements, particularly the campaign against corruption, which witnessed a massive protest all over India, now this Lokpal and Lokayukt bill is in process of being enacted. I mean, the bills are going to be introduced in the parliament. Already many states have started creating the office and the institution of Lokayukt. So these are some of the attempts through which it has been strategized that this governance should be made more inclusive, more transparent, more responsive to the needs of the people. People should be considered part and parcel of this process. It should not be top down. Rather, it will be bottom up, and this decentralized model of development would be in harmony of the larger vision of democracy which was thought of in Indian constitution as per the Gandhian and some other streams of political thought. Now, apart from this state, the second agency we discussed that in this governance, from government to governance, leads to three agencies: state, civil market, and civil society. Now, this good governance required not only tackling the problem of exclusion at the level of a state, which we have discussed through these measures were sought to be addressed, but also at the level of market, that how market can also result into number of exclusions. It is not that market by say, market per se is inclusive, inclusionary. It will include every section of the society. It also result into number of exclusions. Therefore, how to tackle this exclusion at the level of market? Because the 90s, the free enterprises, private initiative, liberalization, privatization, and the massive presence of the market instead of the state which characterized the earlier period, now created this situation where this problem had to be addressed. And therefore, the market, because it was believed that is two types of situations might emerge because of the functioning of the market strategy. Now, one is, both are the risks involved in the market. In normal situation, it may not, but normally, in most of the situations, market basically results into this. One is the failure of the market. Market might fail, and that failure can cause a lot of hardships to the people, and that would be tantamount to exclusion. Now, other is the abuse of the market, that this market, unbridled market, might be abused by certain forces which are dominant there. We have already seen that how it was being abused in the 50s and 60s, leading to a situation where during Indira Gandhi's time, number of measures were taken to curb monopolies. MRTP and other similar measures were taken to curb such monopolies. A handful of capitalists, the big horses, the powerful lobbies, monopolize all resources in league with the state bureaucracy and state agencies. So therefore, on the one hand, you have the risk of failure. On the other hand, you have the risk of abuse. That market might be abused. Market space might be abused. The freedom of the market might be abused by certain agencies. And in Indian context, we have seen in last few years that this abuse, more than the failure, this abuse is becoming more, detrimental to the functioning of our society. We have seen number of scams now coming to the fore. Started with Satyam, and then Telcom, this new types of scams which are coming to the fore regularly, particularly this 2G scam and all sorts of scams which are coming to our notice. I think all these things suggest that how this possibility of abuse of the market freedom, market space, market initiatives are there. Therefore, how to control them, how to address them has been has become very important, particularly in light of some of the scams which have been busted recently, the Satyam, Telcom, and so on and so forth. Now, because of this abuse, we have also witnessed a new sort of nexus being created, which is very dangerous for inclusive governance and for inclusive development. This nexus is not simply between politicians, bureaucrats, and the big business, which was there earlier also, but now new actors are joining hands with this. Now you have recently it has been disclosed that the new actors can also join: the media, politicians, bureaucrats, and the big business. So this type of nexus can result into the abuse of this market strategy, and therefore the requirement to control and curb such possibilities so that it does not lead to exclusion and it facilitate a inclusive governance. So therefore, some independent regulatory machineries and the measures have been thought of. It started in fact in 90s itself when the SEBI was created. Then you had Telecom Regulatory Authority of India 2000. Then subsequently you had the Competition Act of 2002 in order to create a level playing field so that some interests do not monopolize all the space of the market. So Competition Act of 2002. So these measures have been taken as a regulatory measures, as a regulators, as agencies to keep watch and vigil as well as regulate the functioning of the market, but much more is required, because we have seen that there are interests, there are forces which can sabotage the entire process, and particularly after some scams have come to the light, this thing is perhaps more important. Now, what has happened that apart from this state and market, there is a third agency as well, and that is called civil society. That how exclusion at the level of civil society, if we are really interested in inclusive governance, then we don't have to simply address the issues at the level of state and market, but also at the level of civil society. Now, at the civil society, we have seen that number of problems are there. The Indian society is particularly two important problems. One is a caste, other is a class. This caste and class inequalities, they also create exclusions. Now, we have already seen that some of the measures which were thought of earlier as part of our constitutional design, that is land reforms, is still unaccomplished. The caste system has been addressed. The problems emerging due to it have been addressed constitutionally in a different way, but still that problem is yet to be overcome. Now then, there are ethnic and the tribal problems dealing with those areas which are inhabited by them. Now therefore, there is a move for tribal rights, so that their resources, natural resources, their habitat are not encroached. Now number of problems have emerged recently, for example, due to this market state initiatives, and one of them is what is happening is the land acquisition measures of the state. Now we have seen number of protests, number of fights and unrest in different parts of the countries on issue of SEZs, special economic zones. Then you have the land being acquired by the state and handed over to the market forces or the big capital interests, the big business interests, to make use of for their own business purposes. So all these things have been protested in the society recently, for tribal rights, for farmer rights, but at the same time the deprivation problem is increasing. In name of globalization, it was believed that it would tackle the issue of poverty. This new developmental strategy will lead to the eradication of poverty, a more balanced egalitarian growth and development. But in recent years, we have seen a lot of problems emerging. For example, you have the farmer suicide, you have number of problems related to poverty. Poverty index is increasing. Then below poverty line debate, which is already going on because of public distribution system, how they have to address the issues pertaining to hunger, because India is considered to be falling down in the developmental development index table. So these concerns are there, and therefore the exclusion at the civil society are equally frightening. And therefore, how to address these exclusions if one is interested in inclusive governance. So therefore, you have the farmers movement, you have labor unrest, you have the consumers protest, and then you have a lot of demands for reservation along caste line. You have the problems about the tribal resources. You have the problem of Naxalism in certain parts of the country, which people believe is not simply law and order problem, but is also resource based problem. That how the incursion into infiltration into certain pockets of the tribal areas of the country by some business interests have created this sort of protest, or somewhat one can say that development has not been able to touch them, and therefore they totally feel unaffected by the entire thing which is being done in the name of development. So this protest is taking different forms, sometimes the political form, sometimes militant form, sometimes terrorist form, but the thing is that these issues are somewhere related to the issue of deprivation, exclusion, and so on and so forth. Now attempts have been made to address this issue of exclusion at the level of civil society also. For example, the most important measure was this NREGA, now is Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. The act. So basically, what had happened that here the attempt has been made to address this issue of exclusion, that how people should be guaranteed jobs, and this attempt is at the level of right, discourse taking place at the level of rights, not only welfare measures of the state, but it is people's right to get 100 days employment in a year. So I think this issue has basically been addressed at a different level. Similarly, right to education and similar other measures can also be seen as an attempt to create a more inclusive governance where the problems which are emerging because of the functioning of a state, market and the civil society which are creating exclusions are addressed head on. And therefore this NREGA and similar other measures can be seen along with the backward area development programs, and then a special attention has been given to the question of the minorities and their deprivation. Particularly, in last 10 years we have seen, particularly after this UPA government formed a committee headed by Satchar, which popularly became famous as Satchar Committee, to look into the conditions of Muslims in India and their deprivation. And the Satchar Committee report, along with the Ranganath Mishra Committee, which recommended certain measures for the minorities, both linguistic and religious minorities, I think that these measures are also part of the larger discourse of inclusive governance, that how certain sections which in name of religion or other identities are being left behind, are being excluded, how to bring them in this process of development and make them a equal co-traveler in this discourse of inclusive governance. Similarly, you have the unorganized sector. You have the Arjun Sen Gupta Committee report, that how people are living on daily earning of 20 rupees, and how the unorganized sector is facing a big problem. So we have already the poverty debate, that globalization has not created a situation where more and more people are being included in it. So these issues are there, but the main problem that on the one hand the issues of exclusion are being addressed at all three levels: state, market and civil society. But at the same time, because we are a democracy and we are a representative parliamentary democracy, there are other problems which simultaneously emerge. That in order to tackle exclusion, sometimes we also try to bypass the participatory and representative institutions, which create parallel problems. For example, there is already a tendency to go for delegated legislation, where the parliamentarians hand over their responsibility to bureaucrats to legislate, and technocrats replace the elected representatives in parliament. That problem is there. But then there are other non-representative institutions, more and more reliance on the judiciary, particularly Supreme Court through active intervention has tried to address the question of exclusion, but Supreme Court itself is a non-representative body. Then you have market agencies like FICCI, CII, all are non-representative bodies. You have civil society presenting itself as the custodian of people's rights, but civil society itself considered to be a non-representative because they are not routed through electoral channels. For example, this Anna Hazare movement witnessed this type of problem. So this civil society, non-elected nature of civil society is another thing. Absolutely. Similarly, there is a new type of unrest, new type of apprehension on the part of the certain sections which have been getting now foothold in our political process after 60 years, particularly the Dalits, the OBCs, the minorities, which is being called a silent revolution in India, because they're increased participation and representation, and they feel that in name of addressing exclusion, certain non-representative agencies are basically being promoted, and they are occupying the space and undercutting this silent revolution which is taking place in India, and therefore they say that there is an evil design into it. Now all these things are there. Therefore the challenge is that if inclusive governance is to be realized, then how to balance this exclusion on the one hand and the representative spirit of democracy on the other. I think this is the real challenge for India, and now how the political class rises to this occasion is to be seen.
So as we find that you have pointed a genuine problem of inclusion, how the things will come out and will create another kind of problem, and So the better way is to we have to find a solution within the democratic framework.
Channel, yes.
And the point is, but here when the people, one side get adamant and not ready to listen to others, in that case, what an outlet, as we can say, uh, alternative outlet should be provided to those forces.
I mean, then when the political class becomes totally intransigent, doesn't listen to.
Uh, not can be anybody, either it's a representative or the society
Yeah,
member,
in fact, I got
anybody.
it. But basically, see, in fact, we are a democracy and we have a political process. So I think that all such situations have to be tackled politically, and therefore you have enough space for dialogue and negotiations. Now, how this dialogue and negotiation, seek remedies, that is, important thing. There is ample space, but sometimes because this space is short circuited because of some vested interest, therefore the problem is that how to create agencies to checkmate such forces, right? All types of regulatory agencies are there, but still we have problems. So basically the ultimate solution lies politically, that how politically a more vibrant system we create, where there are more participations, more representations, more devolution and decentralization, right?
That is true. At the political level, they can have their voice heard, they can participate, they can engage in the discussion, all that. But when it comes to the administrative decision, because the crux of the administrative behavior is the administrative decision, there administrator have to take a decision.
Right.
And different sort of opinion will pour in, and having input from the different sources. When they sit and take a decision, and in the case they have to see the administrative viability, not the political viability. So in that case, how can we make them a more inclusive decision? Because the thing is not inclusive, one was inclusive decision.
No, you see, in fact, the problem is that when bureaucracy functions and the decision-making process in bureaucracy is still not only in India but most of the places, they are still not rooted through democratic channels, because in name of secrecy, in name of expertise, because they are the ones who believe that they are ultimately the custodian of people's rights, because they know what is good for others, right? So this type of tendency and the mindset
Right.
has to be addressed, and therefore now what we find that a different type of training is being thought of for the bureaucrats. The recruitment process is being overhauled now. That the earlier mode of recruiting bureaucrats, which should be generalist or a specialist debate, is not enough for our purpose.
Right.
Because this colonial setup had a different type of priorities. Our priorities are different.
But
right?
when we stretch our imagination, we find that an individual, a group of individuals, they don't have any mechanism to find out the even expectation of the entire districts. But the district administrator have at their command different agency which can provide them input, and they will come to know about the real situation,
Right.
and also recheck it.
Now this is happening. We discussed, in fact, in case of this 73rd, 74th amendment, because some of the measures which were suggested, because states have been very vocal in demanding their rights from the center, but when it comes to devolution of power below their own level, I mean, this entire provision for district development, a planning board, has not materialized in last 15 years. Now, district planning boards and committees were basically meant to take the feedback from different parts of the district and to provide the administration with the first-hand information that what peoples want. Right. So in absence of such things, naturally the district administrator will say that I have the agencies at my disposal. Yeah. I know their interest because I have the feedback. Right. Since there is no other channel. So if you have the creation of more such channels, the extra space which is taken by the bureaucracy to take decisions, right, will be reduced, and the people's voice will be more and more will be heard. So I think that how to address some of the issues which are constitutionally mandated but have not been put into place. I think these issues are equally important, along with certain other things which are to be thought of in future, which have not been thought of. For example, I say that in order to address exclusion, you are creating other type of exclusion,
Right.
democratic exclusion.
So, well, friends, in last over 62 years, we have number of issues on which we disagree, but there are some issues on which agreement reached, and the steps have been taken to sort out the problem. But there are still, as you know, administration is not a product; it's a process which keeps evolving. So naturally, in the process, there are problems, there are solutions, so which keeps coming and accordingly decisions are taken and get it sorted out by the different agencies. So the debate and discussion will continue, but I hope what our aim was to just to make you aware about what exactly inclusive governance means and how it will transform the administrative process in coming days, and the efforts have been made by on the part of the government and also by some bureaucrats. So these were our aim, and I hope this must have have got benefited from these lectures. So with this hope, we conclude the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Satish Jha for giving such a wonderful lecture on the topic inclusive governance. Thank you very much.